Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, and your bank account still shows the same number, but everything you can buy with it has been cut in half. Imagine pulling up to a gas station and seeing a price that makes you feel like you're living in a different country, a different era, a different reality. Imagine turning on your phone and watching in real time as the stock markets of New York, London, Tokyo, and Dubai all flash red simultaneously, while news anchors struggle to find words to describe what is happening. That moment, the one you just imagined, is no longer hypothetical. It is a timeline. And according to intelligence sources, financial insiders, and geopolitical analysts who have spent decades studying the architecture of global power, that timeline may be closer than anyone is willing to admit publicly. Because right now, in the corridors of power in Riyadh, Beijing, Washington, and Tehran, something historic is unfolding. Something that will not just reshape the Middle East, something that will not just determine the price of oil, something that threatens to dismantle the very financial system that has governed the entire world for the last 50 years. And at the center of it all is one man, one secret meeting, and one decision that could trigger the most consequential economic shift in modern human history. By the end of this video, you will understand why the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran is not primarily about missiles, drones, or nuclear sites. You will understand why every single bomb that has fallen in the last 2 weeks has been sending a message not just to Tehran, but to every oil-producing nation on Earth. You will understand why Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the man who runs the world's most important oil economy, has been making calls to Beijing that Washington is absolutely terrified about. And you will understand why the phrase petrodollar, which most people have never even heard, may be the most important word in the world right now. Stay with me. Because this story starts not in Tehran, not in Tel Aviv, not in Washington. It starts with a system built in the shadows of the 1973 oil crisis. A system so powerful, so invisible, and so deeply embedded in every aspect of your daily life that its collapse would be felt from Manhattan to Mumbai to Lagos within 72 hours. In 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia struck a deal that would reshape the entire post-World War II global order. The details were kept classified for decades. The agreement was simple in structure but revolutionary in consequence. Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, America would provide military protection to the Saudi royal family, guarantee their security, and supply them with weapons. This arrangement quickly spread to the rest of OPEC. And just like that, the US dollar became not just America's currency, it became the world's currency. Every nation on Earth that needed to buy energy had to first acquire US dollars. This created a permanent, structural, and essentially captive global demand for the American currency. It allowed the United States to print money, run deficits, and finance its military and its lifestyle in ways no other country in human history has ever been able to do. The petrodollar was not just a financial arrangement, it was the foundation of American global dominance. And for 50 years, it held. But cracks have been forming for over a decade. And what has happened in the last 12 days in the skies over Iran, the waters of the Persian Gulf, and the boardrooms of Riyadh may have just delivered the crack that breaks it open entirely. Let us go back to where this military confrontation began, because the context is everything. For months, the tension between the United States, Israel, and Iran had been building toward a breaking point that analysts warned was inevitable. Iran's nuclear program had crossed thresholds that Israel considered existential. Back-channel diplomatic efforts had collapsed. Sanctions had failed to produce meaningful policy changes in Tehran. And the transition in Washington had replaced diplomatic caution with strategic aggression. The new administration came in with a clear doctrine, maximum pressure, and, if necessary, maximum force. The opening strikes, when they came, were surgical, coordinated, and devastating in their precision. U.S. and Israeli aircraft targeted Iran's air defense infrastructure first, a strategic necessity designed to blind Tehran before the deeper campaign began. Within 48 hours, the military equation in the region had been fundamentally altered. Iran's ability to project conventional military power had been severely degraded. The nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan were targeted in sequenced waves. Underground bunkers that had been hardened over decades of Iranian investment were penetrated by munitions specifically designed for exactly this purpose. Radar installations went dark, command and control networks were disrupted, and the carefully constructed air defense umbrella that Tehran had built over 20 years of patient development was compromised in ways that would take years to fully restore. But here is what the headlines missed entirely. Iran's military response was not its most dangerous response. Iran's most dangerous response was economic. And that economic response was months in the planning. Because Iranian strategic planners had long understood that in any direct military confrontation with the United States, the path to leverage ran not through battlefield victories, which were impossible, but through economic pain, which was very achievable. The goal was never to win the war. The goal was to make the war so costly, so economically disruptive, so threatening to global stability, that the international community would force Washington and Tel Aviv to the negotiating table before the full scope of what Iran was prepared to do became clear. While the world was watching the missiles and the drone footage and the satellite images of burning facilities, Mohammed bin Salman was on a plane, and the destination of that plane and the conversations that took place at that destination represent the single most consequential geopolitical development of the 21st century so far. But we will get to that in a moment, because first you need to understand what Iran actually did in the Strait of Hormuz and why that single body of water holds the entire global economy hostage. The Strait of Hormuz is, without exaggeration, one of the most strategically important waterway on Earth. It is a narrow choke point, roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and ultimately to the world's oceans. Every single day, approximately 20% of all the oil traded globally passes through this strait. We are talking about 15 to 17 million barrels of crude oil per day. Saudi Arabia's exports, the UAE's exports, Kuwait's, Qatar's, Iraq's, and a portion of Iran's own production all flow through this single narrow channel. There is no viable alternative route for the overwhelming majority of this volume. The pipelines that exist can carry only a fraction of what moves through the water. The port infrastructure to handle a full rerouting does not exist, and the ships that carry this oil have no option but to enter the strait if they want to reach the producing facilities. For decades, Iran has maintained what military planners call an anti-access and area denial capability in the strait. Hundreds of fast attack boats, shore-based missile batteries, naval mines, and submarine assets positioned specifically to threaten or close this waterway if Iran ever chose to do so. It was always considered the ultimate leverage card, the move Iran would play only if it felt its very survival was at stake. On the third day of the conflict, Iran played that card. Not fully, not catastrophically, but enough. Iranian naval assets began what officials in Tehran described as defensive positioning exercises in the strait. The language was deliberately ambiguous, designed to create maximum uncertainty without triggering a full military response. Commercial shipping traffic immediately began to slow. The first vessel to turn back was a Liberian-flagged supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of Saudi crude bound for East Asian markets. Within 6 hours, 4 more vessels had reversed course. Insurance rates for vessels transiting the Gulf spiked to levels not seen since the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, rising from roughly 0.2% of cargo value to over 2% in a single trading session, a tenfold increase that made many voyages financially unviable before a single shot was fired. Several major shipping companies announced they were rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 18 to 24 days and enormous fuel costs to their journeys. And within 24 hours, the signal sent by that partial closure reverberated through every commodity market, every currency exchange, and every financial center on the planet. Oil jumped past $90 per barrel in the first trading session after the Strait announcement, then past $95. Then, as the Fujairah incident added further shock to the system, it crossed $100 per barrel for the first time since the early months of the Russia-Ukraine war. This was not just a price spike, this was a market signal. This was the global financial system recognizing, in real time, that the architecture of energy security it had taken for granted for decades was suddenly frighteningly fragile. And here is where it gets truly alarming, because the oil price is just the beginning of the economic cascade. Let us trace exactly what happens when oil crosses $100 and the strait remains even partially disrupted. Airlines immediately begin to bleed. Jet fuel costs represent between 20 and 30% of an airline's operating expenses in normal conditions. When those costs spike suddenly and without warning, carriers face an impossible choice between raising ticket prices and absorbing losses. Most begin to do both simultaneously. Consumer spending on travel collapses within weeks as ticket prices become prohibitive for ordinary families. Tourism industries in dozens of countries that depend on air travel take an immediate and severe hit. Supply chains, for everything that moves by air, and a significant portion of high-value global commerce does, begin to experience intense pressure. Pharmaceutical shipments, electronics components, fresh produce, all of it becomes more expensive and less reliable. Shipping costs explode. Container freight rates, which had only recently normalized after the post-pandemic surge, began climbing again with the kind of velocity that supply chain managers described as deeply alarming. This means the cost of every manufactured good, every piece of electronics, every article of clothing, every food product that travels by sea begins rising. The consumer feels this not immediately, but within 60 to 90 days, as the price increases work their way through the supply chain with the inevitability of a slow tide. Food prices surge. This is perhaps the least understood consequence of an oil price shock, but it is among the most severe. Modern industrial agriculture is almost entirely dependent on petroleum products. Fertilizers are derived from natural gas and petroleum. Farm machinery runs on diesel. Irrigation systems require electricity generated largely from fossil fuels. Food processing facilities are energy-intensive operations. The transportation of food products at every stage, from farm to processor, to distributor, to retailer, is directly tied to fuel costs. When oil crosses $100, food inflation accelerates in ways that are deeply painful for ordinary people everywhere, but truly catastrophic. For people in developing nations where food can represent 60 to 70% of household expenditure. In these countries, a sustained oil shock does not just mean tighter budgets, it means hunger, it means political instability. It means the kind of social unrest that topples governments and reshapes regions. Central banks face an impossible dilemma that they have faced before, but never under quite these conditions. They had been cautiously managing interest rate policy in an environment of gradually declining inflation following the post-pandemic price surge. A sudden oil-driven inflation shock forces them to choose between raising rates to fight inflation, which risks triggering a recession in already fragile economies, or holding rates steady and allowing inflation to become embedded, which destroys the purchasing power of ordinary citizens over a longer but equally damaging timeline. There is no good option. There is no clean exit. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, all of them were looking at scenarios in their private risk assessments that they had hoped not to face for years, if ever. And the markets knew it. Stock markets began pricing in this reality within hours of the Strait of Hormuz announcement. The S&P 500 dropped 3.5% in a single session, erasing trillions of dollars in paper wealth. European indices fell further. The FTSE, the DAX, the CAC all saw some of their worst single-day performances in years. Emerging market currencies, particularly those of oil-importing nations, began a devaluation spiral that financial analysts were describing in their private communications as deeply worrying and potentially self-reinforcing. The Pakistani rupee, the Egyptian pound, the Turkish lira, the Indian rupee, the Sri Lankan rupee, all came under pressure simultaneously. These are countries with hundreds of millions of people who were already struggling with the cost of living. An oil shock of this magnitude, sustained over weeks rather than days, could translate into genuine humanitarian crises of a scale that would make the post-pandemic economic pain look manageable by comparison. Bond markets told an equally concerning story. The yield on 10-year U.S. Treasury bonds, the benchmark for global borrowing costs, began climbing as investors priced in the prospect of persistent inflation and the fiscal cost of potential military escalation. For every country in the world that borrows in dollars, and there are many, rising treasury yields mean rising borrowing costs, tighter fiscal space, and harder choices between debt service and public services. But here's the thing. All of this, the oil price spike, the shipping disruption, the market volatility, all of this was happening within the existing framework of the petrodollar system. Within the existing assumption that Saudi Arabia would continue to price its oil in dollars, that Gulf state production would continue to flow, that the fundamental architecture of the global energy economy would remain intact even as the region burned around it. The crisis was severe, but it was a crisis within the system, not a crisis of the system itself. And then Mohammed bin Salman landed in Beijing. The meeting was not officially announced. There was no press release, no diplomatic communique, no joint statement with smiling photographs and handshakes for the cameras. What we know about it comes from a combination of satellite imagery of aircraft movements, reports from financial intelligence sources cited by 3 separate major news organizations, and the subsequent behavior of both the Saudi and Chinese governments in the days that followed. What appears to have taken place in those meetings is nothing less than a fundamental renegotiation of the terms on which Saudi Arabia engages with the global financial system. Not the terms of a single deal, not the details of a specific investment, but the strategic orientation of the world's most important oil producer with respect to the 2 great powers competing for dominance of the 21st century. To understand the full weight of what may have been agreed, you need to understand what China has been building for the last decade and a half. The Belt and Road Initiative, the digital yuan project, the expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the patient accumulation of gold reserves that has seen China's official gold holdings grow year after year with quiet persistence, the development of the CIPS cross-border payment system as an alternative to SWIFT, the relentless push to get commodity contracts denominated in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars. None of these things happened by accident. They were pieces of a very long game, a strategic project to build the infrastructure necessary to challenge dollar dominance in global trade, developed over decades with the kind of patient institutional commitment that democratic governments with 4-year electoral cycles simply cannot match. China imports more oil than any other country on earth. It is Saudi Arabia's single largest customer, buying roughly 2 million barrels per day, a figure that has been growing consistently and is projected to grow further as Chinese industrial and transportation demand expands. For years, Beijing has been pressing Riyadh to accept yuan for at least a portion of those purchases. The economic logic is straightforward. Why should China have to first acquire dollars, which means buying American financial assets or earning dollars through trade surpluses, in order to buy oil from a country it trades with directly? The answer, of course, is that the petrodollar system was never primarily about economic efficiency. It was about power. Dollar pricing of oil was an American strategic choice, maintained through American security guarantees and American diplomatic pressure, not because it was the most economically rational arrangement, but because it served American geopolitical interests. Saudi Arabia, sheltered under the American security umbrella, had always declined Beijing's overtures on Yuan-denominated contracts. The petrodollar arrangement, after all, was not just a financial deal. It was a security guarantee, the foundation of a relationship that had provided the Saudi royal family with American backing through multiple regional crises, multiple wars, multiple moments when the House of Saud's survival was genuinely in question. But what happens when Washington's protection, as demonstrated by the current conflict, cannot prevent your oil infrastructure from being threatened? What happens when Iranian drones can reach your refineries, your ports, your oil fields, and the American response is measured in days and weeks rather than the immediate and overwhelming force that the security guarantee always implied? What happens when the security guarantee starts to look less like an ironclad shield and more like a conditional arrangement, subject to the shifting political winds of a Washington that has become increasingly unpredictable, increasingly inward-looking, increasingly prone to using its relationships with Gulf partners as leverage in domestic political debates rather than as strategic assets to be carefully maintained? Mohammed bin Salman is many things, but he is not naive. He has watched the last decade carefully, and he has drawn conclusions from what he has seen. He has watched American foreign policy swing wildly between administrations, with each new White House reversing key commitments of its predecessor. He has watched Washington lecture Riyadh on human rights, while simultaneously begging for production increases during periods of domestic American political vulnerability. He has watched the shale revolution make America an energy exporter and reduce its strategic dependence on Gulf oil, removing one of the primary original motivations for the American commitment to Gulf security. He has watched the Abraham Accords and their complicated aftermath. And he has been doing the math with the cold precision of a man who understands that survival in the 21st century requires strategic diversification. The conversation in Beijing, according to the most credible accounts available, centered on three interconnected questions. First, what does a post-conflict security architecture for the Gulf look like, and what role does China play in it? Second, under what conditions would Saudi Arabia be willing to begin pricing a portion of its oil exports in yuan, and what Chinese economic commitments would accompany that shift? Third, what is the future of Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 modernization program in a world where Western investment and partnership may become more complicated by the political fallout of the current conflict and the strategic tensions it has revealed? And here is what makes this moment so historically significant. For the first time in 50 years, all three of those questions have answers that do not automatically default to Washington. China's military presence in the region has been growing, slowly but deliberately. Its naval facilities in Djibouti, its security agreements with Gulf states, its expanding arms sales to regional powers, all represent a Chinese security footprint that simply did not exist 20 years ago. Its diplomatic credibility in the region, particularly after brokering the Saudi-Iran rapprochement in 2023 in a diplomatic achievement that surprised and alarmed Washington, is real and demonstrated. Its economic weight, as Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner and as the world's largest importer of Gulf oil, is undeniable and growing. And its patience, the willingness to play a decades-long strategic game, rather than demanding immediate results or attaching political conditions to every engagement, is something that Gulf leaders have come to appreciate in sharp contrast to the often transactional and politically complicated nature of American engagement. The specific terms of what may have been agreed remain deliberately unclear, and both governments have every strategic incentive to keep them unclear for now. A sudden dramatic announcement of yuan-denominated oil pricing would be seen by Washington as a direct economic declaration of war, and would trigger an American response that neither Beijing nor Riyadh is ready to manage at this moment. The game being played is subtler than that. It is about establishing the infrastructure, the trust, the precedents, and the contractual arrangements that make a gradual transition possible over the next 3 to 5 years, while maintaining enough ambiguity to manage Washington's reaction in the near term. But even the possibility, even the credible rumor, even the market perception that this conversation is happening sends shockwaves through the global financial system. Because the petrodollar's power is not just mechanical and structural, it is also deeply psychological. It depends on every market participant, every central bank, every sovereign wealth fund believing that dollar dominance in energy markets is permanent and unchallengeable. The moment that belief starts to erode, even slightly and even among a small number of key actors, behavior changes. Reserves get diversified away from dollars. Commodity contracts get renegotiated into alternative currencies where the political will exists. Alternatives get explored and tested and developed, and a slow motion but inexorable shift begins that is very difficult to reverse once it achieves sufficient momentum. Currency analysts at several major investment banks began issuing private notes to their institutional clients in the 72 hours after the Beijing visit became known in financial intelligence circles. The language in those notes was carefully hedged, as it always is in official financial communications, where the very act of stating a concern too directly can contribute to the outcome one is analyzing. But the message was unambiguous for those who knew how to read it. The structural assumptions underlying long-term dollar demand need to be reassessed. The trajectory of dollar hegemony faces credible challenges that did not exist, or at least were not this visible and this urgent 12 months ago. Meanwhile, back in the physical world, the Gulf was anything but stable. Iran's strategic posture, even after absorbing significant damage to its military infrastructure, remained based on a doctrine of asymmetric pressure that had been refined over decades of planning for exactly this scenario. The regime understood, going into this conflict, that it could not win a conventional military exchange against the combined capabilities of the United States and Israel. That was never the plan. The plan was to impose costs, to demonstrate that challenging Iran comes with consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. To use every lever available, military, economic, diplomatic, and informational, to make the price of this confrontation so high that the international community would eventually conclude that a negotiated arrangement was preferable to continued escalation. The targeting of Gulf state infrastructure was integral to this doctrine rather than a tactical improvisation. UAE ports, Saudi oil facilities, Bahrain's financial district with its concentration of regional banking operations, Qatar's liquefied natural gas installations that had become critical to European energy security in the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war. These were not random targets chosen in the heat of the moment. They were selected with care because of their economic significance, because of their importance to the global energy system, because attacking them sent a message simultaneously to the Gulf states themselves, to the United States, whose regional strategy depended on Gulf stability, and to global energy markets whose pricing of risk would determine the economic cost of continued conflict. Saudi Arabia's response to the attacks on its territory was revealing in what it chose not to do as much as in what it did. Riyadh condemned the attacks publicly and in appropriately strong diplomatic language, as protocol required. Saudi air defenses performed effectively, as they had been trained and equipped to do with American assistance over many years. But Saudi Arabia did not call for escalation. It did not demand a massive American retaliatory campaign against Iranian territory. It did not invoke mutual defense arrangements in ways that would have locked Washington into a specific and binding course of action. Instead, Saudi diplomatic channels opened quietly and simultaneously in three directions: toward Washington, to manage the immediate security situation, toward Beijing to explore the longer-term strategic implications, and toward neutral intermediaries, with established communication lines to Tehran, to begin exploring what a managed de-escalation might look like. This is not the behavior of a country that sees itself purely as a U.S. ally and dependent client state with no independent strategic agency. This is the behavior of a country that has been carefully and deliberately recalibrating its strategic position for years, and that sees the current crisis as both a genuine threat to its security and, handled with sufficient skill, an opportunity to reshape the terms of its relationships with the major powers on terms more favorable to Saudi long-term interests. For MBS specifically, the calculations are deeply personal as well as coldly strategic. His entire Vision 2030 project, the comprehensive plan to modernize Saudi Arabia's economy, diversify it away from oil dependence, and establish Riyadh as a global hub for technology, entertainment, tourism, and finance, depends on two things above all others: a stable regional security environment and the continued flow of massive foreign investment. The current conflict threatens both with equal severity. Every week of regional instability is a week of delayed investment decisions by multinationals who have internal risk protocols that automatically pause new commitments in conflict-adjacent environments. It is a week of canceled tourism bookings by international travelers who see Middle East tension and choose other destinations. It is a week of nervous sovereign wealth funds quietly reducing their Saudi exposure and waiting to see how the situation resolves before recommitting. The Beijing arrangement, if it materializes in the form suggested by the most credible available intelligence, would address several of these concerns with a single strategic move. Chinese investment in Vision 2030 projects, in the smart city developments, in the renewable energy infrastructure, in the technology and entertainment sectors that MBS is trying to build, could accelerate dramatically and provide an alternative to Western investment that has become more politically complicated. Chinese technology partnerships, particularly in artificial intelligence, clean energy development, and telecommunications infrastructure, could substitute for or complement Western technology relationships that are increasingly subject to American political pressure and export controls. Chinese security commitments, even if informal and incremental in the near term, could reduce Saudi dependence on American protection in ways that give Riyadh more strategic freedom of movement. And a gradual shift toward Yuan-denominated energy contracts could give Saudi Arabia a new and powerful economic lever in its relationship with Beijing, creating the kind of mutual dependency that is the foundation of durable strategic partnerships. The irony, deeply appreciated by Chinese strategic planners who have been patient enough to see this moment coming from a long way away, is that American military action in the region, intended to reassert U.S. dominance, deter Iranian aggression, and demonstrate the continued relevance of American power as the region's ultimate security guarantor, may be accelerating exactly the process of strategic realignment that Washington most fears. Every bomb dropped in the name of American security interests in the Gulf is a reminder to Gulf leaders that their security is ultimately contingent on American political will, and American political will has proven, repeatedly and across administrations, to be an unreliable foundation for long-term strategic planning. Now, let us talk about what the rest of the world is doing as all of this unfolds, because the international response to the U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict has been equally revealing of the tectonic shifts underway in the global order. Russia, already under sweeping Western sanctions due to its ongoing war in Ukraine, has watched the Gulf crisis with barely concealed strategic satisfaction. Moscow is a major oil and gas exporter, and every dollar increase in the price of crude is additional revenue flowing into Russian coffers, partially offsetting the economic pressure of Western sanctions and helping to fund a war economy that has proven more resilient than many Western analysts predicted. Russia has been vocal in its diplomatic support for Iran, blocking or complicating Western efforts to build meaningful international coalitions against Tehran at the United Nations and in other multilateral forums. And Russian state media has been aggressively promoting the narrative that the United States is a fundamentally destabilizing force in international affairs, a country that starts wars it cannot finish and imposes its will on the global system through financial coercion rather than legitimate leadership. This narrative resonates in many parts of the global south in ways that Western commentators consistently underestimate. China has been more carefully calibrated in its public positioning, as it always is in situations where it has significant interests on multiple sides of a conflict. Beijing's public statements have called consistently for de-escalation and dialogue, for a return to diplomatic engagement, for respect for international law and the sovereignty of all states. China has significant trade relationships with Israel, with the Gulf states, with Iran, and with the United States, and it has no interest in being forced to choose sides publicly before the strategic situation has clarified and the path of least cost has become clear. But China's private diplomacy, including most significantly the MBS meeting, tells a different and more decisive story. Beijing is actively, deliberately, and with considerable sophistication, positioning itself as the alternative security guarantor, the alternative financial partner, the alternative source of economic stability in a region where American power is being openly contested for the first time in decades. India, the world's third largest oil consumer and a country with unique exposure to Gulf instability through its massive diaspora population working in the region and remitting money home, and through its fundamental dependence on Gulf energy imports, has been among the most vocal of the major emerging economies in calling for immediate de-escalation. New Delhi understands with particular clarity what a sustained oil shock would do to its economy, its fiscal position, its currency, and ultimately its political stability. India is a democracy with elections and a government that presides over a dramatic increase in fuel prices and food prices triggered by a foreign conflict it had no role in starting faces. Consequences at the ballot box that focus the mind wonderfully. India has made clear through multiple diplomatic channels that it cannot be counted on to support any escalation that threatens energy supplies, regardless of which alliance system is doing the escalating, or which alliance India is nominally aligned with. The European Union, already struggling with the economic aftershocks of the Russia-Ukraine war and the monumental cost of rebuilding European energy security after the Russian gas cutoff, faces a scenario that its energy security planners had identified as a worst-case possibility, but hoped would never materialize simultaneously with the Ukrainian conflict. European energy security, rebuilt with enormous financial cost and considerable political pain over the past 4 years, was fundamentally predicated on the continued availability of Middle Eastern oil, and particularly of liquefied natural gas from Qatar, the UAE, and ultimately from the broader Gulf region. Qatar dramatically increased its LNG exports to Europe in the aftermath of the Russian supply cutoff, and European governments signed long-term contracts with Gulf producers with a sense of relief that they had found a reliable alternative to Russian energy. A Gulf conflict that threatens those supplies pulls the rug out from under a European economic recovery that was already fragile, already contested politically, and already generating the kind of public frustration with governing elites that was finding expression in the rise of populist movements across the continent. And this is where the story comes full circle. Back to the petrodollar, back to the architecture of the global financial system, back to the question that determines not just the price of your gasoline, but the fundamental structure of economic power in the 21st century. The petrodollar system works because it is a network effect. Its power derives not from any single bilateral arrangement between Washington and Riyadh, but from the fact that virtually every country on Earth participates in it, because virtually every country on Earth needs energy, and energy is priced in dollars. The system is self-reinforcing because the more universally it is used, the more convenient and necessary it becomes. Breaking that network requires not just one country deciding to use a different currency for some transactions. It requires enough countries, with enough economic weight and enough political will, making enough alternative arrangements at sufficient scale that the dollar's effective monopoly on energy pricing begins to erode in ways that create their own momentum. The question that analysts, investors, and government officials around the world are now asking, in hushed tones and carefully hedged language in private, is whether this moment, this particular convergence of military escalation, economic disruption, and strategic repositioning represents the tipping point. Not the sudden, dramatic, overnight end of dollar dominance, which is unlikely and probably impossible in the near term for structural reasons that even the most fervent dollar pessimists acknowledge. But the beginning of a transition that is now moving fast enough, backed by enough economic weight and political will on the Chinese and Gulf sides, that it has achieved a degree of irreversibility that did not exist 12 months ago. There are legitimate reasons to be cautious about overstating the immediacy of that transition. The dollar's dominance is deep and structural in ways that take years or decades to unwind, even when the political will for change is clear and consistent. Alternative payment systems, including China's CIPS and the various digital currency pilot programs, are still far less liquid, far less trusted by the global commercial banking system, and far less practically convenient than the dollar-denominated systems they seek to replace. Saudi Arabia's security dependence on the United States, whatever MBS may be privately negotiating in Beijing, remains real and significant, grounded in decades of military integration, equipment interoperability, intelligence sharing, and institutional relationships that cannot be replaced quickly. And the inertia of existing contracts, existing correspondent banking relationships, and existing reserve holdings means that even if the political will for change is fully present, the practical execution of that change takes time that the current crisis may not provide in sufficient measure. But there are equally compelling and increasingly urgent reasons to take the threat to dollar dominance seriously, rather than dismissing it as the perennial prediction of gold bugs and geopolitical alarmists. The trend lines have been moving in one direction for over a decade. The share of global reserves held in dollars has declined from over 70% in the early 2000s to below 60% today, a slow but consistent movement that reflects deliberate diversification decisions by dozens of central banks. The number of bilateral trade agreements denominated in non-dollar currencies has been increasing, with China having successfully negotiated yuan-denominated commodity contracts with Russia, Iran, and increasingly with Gulf producers. China's economic weight in the global system has grown to a point where its currency preferences and its institutional arrangements cannot be ignored by any country that depends on Chinese trade or Chinese investment, which is to say, most of the world. And the cumulative effect of American foreign policy decisions over the past 2 decades has been to reduce, among many countries in the global south, the sense that American power is a source of international stability rather than a source of international instability. The world does not change overnight. But there are moments when the pace of change accelerates beyond what seemed possible, when decisions made in private meetings and military command centers and financial boardrooms converge to push history faster than any individual actor intended or predicted or planned for. And this moment, this extraordinary convergence of military conflict, economic disruption, strategic repositioning, and currency geopolitics, looks very much like one of those rare inflection points that historians, looking back, identify as the moment when one era ended and another began. Let us think about what the next 30 to 90 days could look like, not as confident prediction, but as serious scenario analysis of the kind that a responsible investor or geopolitical strategist would undertake before making consequential decisions. In the most optimistic scenario, the military conflict in the Gulf reaches a ceasefire agreement within the next 2 to 3 weeks. American diplomatic pressure on Israel, combined with back-channel communications with Tehran, mediated by Qatar or Oman, as they have been in previous crises, produces an arrangement that stops the immediate shooting without requiring either side to acknowledge publicly that they have made concessions. Oil prices, which have spiked dramatically, begin to gradually retreat over 6 to 8 weeks as shipping lanes reopen and Gulf production resumes full operation. Stock markets stabilize and begin a cautious recovery. Central banks breathe a carefully qualified sigh of relief. The petrodollar system survives this particular crisis, though the structural challenges it faces have been sharply highlighted, and the credibility of the arrangements that underpin it has been meaningfully reduced. In a more challenging scenario, the ceasefire does not come quickly. The military and political dynamics on both sides make compromise difficult in the near term. The strait remains disrupted for weeks. Oil climbs to $120, $130 per barrel as the market prices in extended disruption. The global economy, already operating with limited buffers, tips into a synchronized recession. Emerging market debt crises multiply as dollar borrowing costs rise and commodity revenues fall for oil importing nations. Political instability in developing nations accelerates. And the MBS Beijing arrangements, no longer a slow and careful managed transition, but an emergency pivot driven by the immediate inadequacy of American security guarantees, begin to take concrete and visible form faster than anyone had planned. In the most severe scenario, the one that serious analysts keep in their risk matrices even when they hope it remains unlikely, the conflict expands in ways that directly threaten Gulf production capacity at scale. Major oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, or the UAE, is seriously damaged in ways that cannot be quickly repaired. The strait closes not partially but completely for a sustained period. The global economy enters a severe recession driven by an energy crisis unlike anything seen since the 1970s, and possibly worse in its effects, given the higher baseline of global economic integration and financial leverage. And the petrodollar system, under this extreme and sustained stress, begins to fracture in ways that are no longer gradual and managed, but sudden and potentially chaotic. Financial systems are ultimately systems of belief. They work because people believe they will work. They function because the overwhelming majority of participants expect the rules to remain stable and the institutions to remain solvent and the arrangements to remain in force. When that belief begins to erode, even incrementally, even among a small but influential subset of key participants, the erosion can accelerate in ways that are very difficult to stop and sometimes impossible to reverse. This dynamic is true of individual banks facing runs, and it is equally true of entire currency systems and the geopolitical arrangements that underpin them. Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, the Public Investment Fund, manages nearly $900 billion in assets and is one of the largest and most strategically consequential investors in the world. The portfolio decisions made by that fund over the coming months, what currencies its holdings are denominated in, what assets it holds and where, what new relationships it establishes with counterpart sovereign funds in China versus those in the United States and Europe, are not merely financial decisions in any conventional sense. They are geopolitical signals of the highest order. They are strategic communications from a country that is telling the world, through its investment choices, which way it believes history is moving and on which side of that movement it intends to be positioned. China's long-term strategy, built over 15 years of patient institutional construction, has succeeded in creating genuine and credible alternatives at every level of the international financial infrastructure. Alternative payment messaging systems, alternative reserve currency instruments, alternative development finance institutions, alternative commodity pricing frameworks. None of these alternatives is yet as liquid, as trusted, or as practically convenient as the American-dominated institutions they seek to complement or replace. But they are real, they are operational, and they are capable of handling enough volume to demonstrate viability and build the confidence and familiarity that are the preconditions for wider adoption. The Gulf states sit precisely at the intersection of these competing influences and competing visions for the global order. They have deep and institutionally embedded security ties with the United States, ties that include not just political commitments, but physical infrastructure, pre-positioned military equipment, basing agreements, and decades of military-to-military relationships. They have rapidly growing economic ties with China, ties that now surpass their economic relationship with the United States by most measures of bilateral trade volume. They have cultural and religious connections across the Muslim world that create obligations and opportunities that neither Washington nor Beijing fully appreciates or effectively leverages. They have sovereign wealth that gives them meaningful leverage with virtually every major economy that wants their investment. And they have, in the current generation of Gulf leadership, rulers who are more strategically sophisticated, more willing to challenge inherited assumptions, more focused on long-term national interests, independent of external pressures, and more capable of playing great powers against each other than their predecessors ever were. This is the context in which the secret financial pact, whatever its precise details, must be understood. It is not simply a transaction between two countries seeking mutual commercial advantage. It is a symptom of a profound structural shift in the global order that was already well underway before the first bomb of the current conflict fell, and that will continue to unfold with its own momentum long after the immediate military situation resolves, regardless of how that resolution looks. What you are witnessing, in real time, is the beginning of a transition between eras. Not the sudden, dramatic collapse of the petrodollar system, not the overnight displacement of American global dominance by a Chinese alternative, but something that is in many ways more consequential, precisely because it is gradual, structural, and driven by forces that cannot be reversed by any single military action or any single diplomatic arrangement. The world is becoming multipolar, not just in its military and political dimensions, which has been visible for over a decade, but in its financial architecture. And the Gulf, which has been the foundation and the fulcrum of that financial architecture for half a century, is now the arena in which the terms of the next era are being negotiated. For ordinary people, for families managing household budgets in Karachi and Cairo and Lagos and Jakarta and Mexico City, the implications are immediate, concrete, and personal. The price of energy affects everything you buy, everything you eat, everywhere you go, every product made in a factory that uses electricity or ships its goods in a truck or on a container ship. The stability of the global financial system affects every mortgage payment, every pension valuation, every savings account, every business loan, every government service funded by tax revenues. The question of which currency dominates global trade determines which countries can borrow cheaply to invest in their people and which countries face crushing debt costs, which economies can run deficits to manage recessions, and which are forced into austerity by market discipline, which governments can fund their militaries and their welfare states, and which cannot. The decisions being made right now in Washington and Riyadh and Beijing and Tehran and Brussels and New Delhi will determine the answers to those questions for the next generation. The leaders making those decisions are thinking about power and strategy and national interest, as leaders always have. But the consequences of those decisions will be felt in the price of bread, and the cost of electricity, and the availability of jobs, and the stability of currencies, by billions of people who have no voice in the conversations happening in those private meetings, and no influence over the choices being made in their name or at their expense. This is why the story of the petrodollar's potential transformation matters beyond the world of finance and geopolitics, and beyond the audience of investors and analysts and government officials who follow these developments professionally. It matters because the system being renegotiated is the system that structures the material conditions of ordinary life for every person on the planet who participates in the global economy in any way, which is to say, virtually all of us. Its transformation, whether managed or chaotic, gradual or sudden, peaceful or turbulent, will reshape the economic reality of the 21st century in ways whose full extent we are only beginning to understand, and whose full consequences we cannot yet fully predict. The next 24 hours will not resolve any of this. Neither will the next week, or the next month, or perhaps even the next year. The forces at work are too large, too complex, too deeply embedded in the institutional and psychological architecture of the international system to resolve in any short time frame. But the decisions made in this period, the directions chosen or foreclosed by the actions of the key players in this drama, will set the trajectory for a transition that could take a decade or a generation to complete, and that will be studied by historians long after everyone currently involved has left the stage. Watch the Strait of Hormuz. Watch the oil price. Watch the currency markets and the movements in sovereign reserve portfolios. Watch the private diplomatic channels between Riyadh and Beijing and the signals they send through investment decisions and contract negotiations. Watch the behavior of sovereign wealth funds and central bank reserve managers who are the most sophisticated and the most consequential participants in this story. Watch the quiet conversations between finance ministers at international meetings where the real decisions are made without cameras or press releases. Because that is where the real war is being fought, not just in the skies over Isfahan or the waters of the Persian Gulf, but in the architecture of the global financial system itself, in the question of which currency buys the world's energy, and in the answer to the question that has been the foundation of American global power for 50 years, and that is now, for the first time in that 50 years, genuinely and credibly in play. The petrodollar was never inevitable. It was a choice, made under specific historical circumstances, by specific leaders pursuing specific interests in a specific moment of American power and Saudi vulnerability, and choices, however consequential and however deeply embedded in the institutional habits and commercial practices of the world, can be revisited when the circumstances change sufficiently and the will to change them is backed by sufficient economic and political weight. The conditions that made the petrodollar arrangement compelling in 1974 are not the conditions of 2026. The balance of economic power has shifted. The reliability of American commitments has been repeatedly tested and repeatedly found wanting. The alternatives to dollar-denominated energy markets now exist at a scale and a level of operational credibility that they simply did not possess even 5 years ago. Whether the petrodollar survives this crisis, whether the Beijing meeting marks the beginning of something genuinely new in the architecture of global finance, or whether the forces of inertia and institutional habit prove stronger than the pressures for change, we will know more as the days and weeks unfold. What we know already, what this conflict has made impossible to deny, is that the question is no longer hypothetical, no longer academic, no longer the concern only of specialists and theorists and those with an ideological axe to grind. It is the question that the most powerful financial and political actors in the world are grappling with right now, in real time, under conditions of military conflict and economic stress that permit neither comfortable delay nor confident prediction, and that demand answers before the world is ready to give them. The final hours of an era rarely announce themselves clearly. They look, from the inside, like just another crisis, just another escalation, just another moment of tension that will eventually pass as all the previous ones have. It is only in retrospect that the inflection point becomes visible, that the moment when everything changed can be identified and studied and understood. We may be living through one of those moments right now. The bombs are falling, the markets are moving, the meetings are happening, and the world that emerges from this moment may look different in ways that none of us have fully prepared for. That is where we are. That is what is at stake. And that is why, in the middle of a military conflict generating enormous attention for its immediate strategic and human dimensions, the most important story may be the one unfolding in quiet rooms, far from the battlefield and the trading floors, where the financial architecture of the next 50 years is being decided by men who understand that the greatest power is not the power to destroy, but the power to determine what the world uses as money. If this video gave you clarity on something the mainstream financial news is barely touching, then share it immediately with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening right now beneath the surface, because the very people making these enormous consequential decisions are counting on the rest of us not paying close enough attention. And if you want to stay ahead of what comes next, because this story is absolutely far from over, then make sure you do not miss what we cover next. The very next chapter of this rapidly unfolding crisis may be the one that changes the global order permanently, and when it breaks, you will want to already understand exactly how we got here.